Okay.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Milstein, and I am the 1L Engagement Rep for the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. Today, I am honored to be with Senator Jeff Golden, Oregon State Senator for District 3. Senator Golden attended Harvard University as a national scholar during the height of the Vietnam War and decided to swap the Ivy Halls for 20 acres in the backwoods of Oregon and used a chainsaw. He has spent the last 35 years in politics, broadcasting and editorial journalism, and organizational consulting. His political career includes service as a Jackson County Commissioner, Chief of Staff to the Oregon State President, and recently the chair of the Committee on Environmental and Natural Resources. Thank you so much for being here today, Senator.
I'm glad to be here, Lisa. I'm glad to be part of this conference.
Senator, I wanted to start today's conversation off by talking about your recent floor speech regarding the Board of Forestry's nominations. Can you walk us through what was happening and why you feel so strongly about the process?
I'm glad you asked. I think it's a really important issue, and I don't think it's getting the conversation it deserves. You know, one of the Senate has the role of confirming the nominations that the governor makes to just a whole dozens of boards and commissions for the state of Oregon. And for the most part, there's not much controversy. You know, there's one for the Board of Podiatry and nursing, and, you know, you name it, we have a board or commission for it. Governor nominates and the Senate confirms. And 2-3 weeks ago, we were called back to Salem, the Senate, in order to confirm a list of 90 plus governor's appointments, citizens from all over the states to all kinds of boards and commissions. Very rarely are any of them controversial or worth, you know, that anything that anyone wants to argue about. The exception tends to be the boards that govern our natural resource agencies. So the Department of Environmental Quality, Water Resources Division, Department of Forestry, Department of Fish and Wildlife. Those are very consequential because most of the rules, most of the environmental decisions that get made really aren't by the legislature. They're by these commissions that oversee the department. So the Board of Forestry, which, as you know, has a lot of controversial issues before it, either approves or rejects the rules that the Department of Forestry proposes for streamside buffers, for logging, for any numbers of things. So and the legislature is involved with that rulemaking. So as a practical matter, maybe the most important thing the Senate does on environmental issues is confirm or reject these appointments that the governor makes. The governor spends a long time trying to find slates of candidates that are acceptable enough to the timber industry and to the environmental community that they can pass. And this isn't just Board of Forestry, it's the other agencies too. And for many years, the bargaining about who should be on these boards goes on in back rooms. And a very small number of senators will put their thumbs up and thumbs down. And if the governor doesn't, if there's not 16 votes out of 30, they never see the light of day. They don't go, there's no public discussion about them. So the first thing that a nominee has to do is go before the Senate Rules Committee, and then they approve it and send it on to the Senate floor. Well, for the second time in 3 months, the governor proposed a slate of 3 candidates, meticulously balanced, a lot of negotiation, and they were withdrawn before they could get to the Senate floor because a couple of senators thought that they weren't timber industry minded enough. So, okay, we're going to disagree on that, who should be on. My problem is those don't go on in the public light of day, and the senators aren't accountable for their vote. They can kill these nominees, these nominations, without having to stand up and explain why. And I think that's wrong. I think essentially that's making environmental policy in in the dark. So I stood up on the Senate floor and said so 2 weeks ago, and to protest the way it's going, voted no against the single vote of 90 plus candidates to board and commissions. I had no problem with any of the people at all. They were good people. But I wanted to say we have to stop appointing these boards out of the light of public scrutiny. We need public discussion about all this.
Very interesting. I know you are the chair of the Senate Interim Committee on Wildfire Reduction and Recovery, which is something that weighs heavy on a lot of Oregonians in the recent wildfires that occurred throughout the state. I have a couple of questions regarding this. First, is there any legislation in the Senate or House that is geared towards making sure they do not happen again, or we are more prepared if they do?
Well, first of all, a little bit of an update. That committee sunsetted, and its work went into the more general Senate Environment and Natural Resources Committee, which I now chair. So we'll be taking those up. But to your question, in the 2020 session, at the beginning of this year, we had what's called the short session, 35-day session. And the Wildfire Committee approved a number of measures, most of which had come out of a year's work of the Wildfire Council, which the governor appointed after the terrible wildfires of 2017 and 2018. So there were three categories of measures. One was called mitigation, by which they meant prevention, and mostly that was about reducing the fuels, the forest load that has built up over the years because of so much suppression of forest fires, and other kinds of forest restoration. Another category was suppression. How do you fight the fires once they start? And the third was community adaptation, which is building code issues, defensible space around buildings so that the fire doesn't really get going in the urban interface, evacuation issues, smoke mitigation issues. And we passed a bill with a lot of provisions, including a lot of fuel reduction in certain areas. And that bill died, as did 95% of the legislation from 2020, when one party walked out to deny a quorum. So none of that became law after a lot of hard work. And some of it would have made some difference in the wildfire season we've just seen. A lot of it was longer term work and probably wouldn't have. But we are bringing some of that legislation back in 2021 in the session to come. And the emphasis, the facts are that we don't have the resources, the dollars we need to do the forest restoration part. If we do it, it's going to be with a level of commercial log sales to finance it that a lot of people, me included, will have trouble supporting. You don't want to cut irresponsibly just to pay for other forest programs. And we don't have the tax revenue to do it. So the real emphasis will be on that community adaptation in what's called the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface, which includes a lot of towns in Oregon, to try to do what we can to prepare communities for future wildfire. Then we're looking at federal legislation for more forest health, forest restoration measures. But I have to add, there's a lot of environmental controversy about that part of all this. How much fuel do you reduce? Where do you reduce it? And there's suspicion because in the past, forest health measures, so-called, have been proposed that really were ways to enter the backcountry and get into stands of old growth, high value timber that are not part of our wildfire problem. So that's where this becomes a hot political issue. But we'll be doing quite a bit in the 2021 session.
So the bill that you referenced earlier, was that the bill that the Senate passed, 1602?
No, that's something different. Also an important piece of legislation. During the last session, a memorandum of understanding was announced between a representative group of the timber industry and a representative group of the environmental community. And the real reason I think it came about was that both environmental folks and industry folks were getting ready to mount initiative campaigns about forest management that were going to be pretty brutal and very expensive. So they got together and said, let's see what we can work out. And they agreed to a few things, especially around spraying, pesticides, herbicides, and the buffers that you need between waterways and back from waterways in order to spray, and a notification system which hasn't existed before that requires notification of people in areas near spraying. And then they agreed that they would do extended mediation to revise the State Forest Practices Act, which is the law that applies to private timber holdings, not to federal or state government forests, but to private timber holdings, having to do with, the kind of slopes you can log on, how close you can log to streams, what kind of survival rate you need for replanting after a cut, those kinds of things, which a lot of people feel have been too lax or unenforced in Oregon. And this group has agreed to negotiate in good faith to see if we can get past the old timber wars and get to an agreement on some of these measures. I support it. I think it's a great thing. I know there are people both in the environmental and the timber industry communities who are suspicious of it and afraid of giving up too much, but I really think we have to give it a try.
Next, what do you think we as citizens can be doing to stop wildfires or help the climates that are most affected?
Boy, there's a big question, a question with a big answer. Well, I think the good news is that there are a number of really important groups, citizen groups working on this. So nobody, while all of us ought to look at our personal lifestyle and our carbon footprints and saying, in our consumption levels, I think that's important because I think ultimately we're not going to solve these problems until collectively our consumption patterns change. But there are also activist groups who've been really doing this for a while and really learned a lot. There's the Citizens Climate Lobby, CCL, trying to get national legislation. There's Climate Solutions, headquartered in Portland and Seattle, doing great work. You're in Eugene. Eugene has its own local groups. My district has something called Rogue Climate, generally younger activists. So anybody who's ready to put in time has plenty of places they can go that are already underway. So I think political action is really important. There are legislators and Congress people who are ready to take bold action on climate. Pretty much all the Democrats in the Oregon legislature, and there are those who are not, which is pretty much all Republicans in the Oregon legislature. And that's a mix. Some say we don't have a problem. Those are getting fewer and fewer. Some say we probably do, but human activity doesn't have much to do with it. There's always been these cycles in the climate. Some say, well, maybe human activity does have to do it with it, but Oregon's just a small state with a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the world's emissions, and this is a global problem. So let's wait for the federal government and other governments to solve this instead of us. But if people believe, as I do, that we have a responsibility to really move on this and to develop strong statewide solutions, they need to get involved with politics and not just vote, but to get really be in communication with their elected representatives at the state, city, county, and federal levels, in coordination with those groups I mentioned before, and say, you've got a responsibility to your kids and grandkids, and we don't think you're taking it seriously enough. So that all of that political action is really important right now.
Perfect. And what are your suggestions for uh, taking steps to fight climate change within the Oregon Senate specifically?
Well, as you probably know, we had a bill that was worked on since long before I got there. I've only had 2 sessions. I was elected in 2018, had what we call a long session. That's what we have every odd numbered year, and a short session in 2020. Both of those were disrupted and abbreviated by walkouts that deprived us of the quorum we need to do business. In Oregon, there needs to be a 2/3 quorum of the House and the Senate. So that means 20 out of the 30 senators, 40 out of the 60 representatives in order to do business. And in both sessions, Republicans walked out rather than let a vote happen on the climate bill. So that was a so-called cap and trade bill that was quite complex, more complex than I would have liked. Because when you have complex legislation, I think it's really easy to distort and misrepresent it. And I feel very strongly that that's what happened with that bill. And we had, there was one Republican senator who said, they were criticized for walking out, for not doing their job. And what they said was, we Democrats left them with no choice because we had this agenda for this stupid bill that wouldn't really be effective and would ruin rural Oregon communities. One senator from the Roseburg area said, I don't really like walking out, but I had to because Democrats were bringing legislation that would burn our communities to the ground. And he wasn't talking about forest fires. He was talking about, a possible impact on the cost of gasoline or diesel or that kind of thing. So I won't go into all the details, but it's really important that people try to get the clear information on what these bills would and wouldn't do. And the fact that states that have started what we call pricing carbon, putting a cost on carbon emissions, basically starting to make polluters pay. And those of us who enjoy their products pay for the environmental damage that's happening. States and provinces that have done that are seeing not damage to their economy, but real benefits to their economy. And that, the green energy transition is creating jobs directly and indirectly all over the country. So we're missing out on that. So we will be bringing back legislation, likely nothing like that for the near future. But there are other measures underway. General label for it is 100% clean because while Oregon has a higher percentage of its electricity generated from non-carbon sources than most states, mostly because we get so much from Bonneville Power Administration, which is hydropower, we still have in the mix a fair bit of coal, mostly from power plants. A little bit, there's a Boardman power plant in Oregon that'll be shutting down fairly soon. But we still import coal-fired power from Wyoming and other places in the Rockies. And there's a set of measures that want to get us off that onto completely non-carbon fuels by about 2035. And that and trying to electrify the fleet, putting in EV charging stations, doing other things that make it easier for people who aren't very wealthy to get into either very high efficiency or electric vehicles. And then we'll be looking at the industrial sources like we did with the bills that failed in the future. But I'm one who says, if our choices are waiting until somebody else takes leadership, waiting until we have a White House that's serious about this problem, and we might soon, we'll see, or trying to develop state programs that can be developed all over the state, or all over the country, we should do the second. And people say, what are you going to tell your kids and grandkids when they asked, what did you do when it was so clear what was going on? And if people aren't clear with the climate chaos we've seen in the last few years, they never will be. I want to be able to tell my kids and grandkids, well, here's what I did. We did our very best, and So I continue to be really committed to climate action and really certain, not that it's going to be pain-free and there'll be no issues at all and there won't be a single job loss. That's silly. This is a big transition. It'll be disruptive. But that along with that disruption, there is a tremendous amount of economic opportunity here.
Climate change disproportionately affects minority communities. Is there anything you yourself or your colleagues are working on to directly impact these communities that are often overlooked?
Well, I certainly hope that's changing. And at least the conversation about it is definitely changing. We hear all the time now about EJ, environmental justice. And, you know, the governor, when our climate bills failed, the governor put out a little cluster of executive orders on the climate and to get us to that 100% clean goal that I talked about, and to make sure that the state agencies are operating as sustainably as possible. And each of the agencies are now designing plans to be more sustainable and carbon free. And one of the lenses that they're all required to look through is how will this affect historically disadvantaged communities and communities of color? And they have to address that. There's more and more, just about every climate conversation I'm a part of these days looks at that. And the advocates, the people who represent some of those organizations, there's a couple in the Portland area, one called Verde, one called Opal, and they have been really prominent in the Capitol, and their voices are being heard right now. And there's certain issues, you know, the bills that we had that you know caused all the controversy had something called offsets, and that's an ability of industry and emitters to meet some of their obligation by reducing carbon emissions elsewhere. So they might buy, you know, protect forests in the Amazon for carbon sequestration and offset some of their emissions that way. And the disadvantaged communities, the communities of color that are sometimes near industrial emissions, have opposed that and said, if you do that, you don't get the emissions reduction and the benefits in our communities. So we're looking really, really hard at that. And there's no going back now. We have to pair environmental justice with carbon reduction, and you're going to see that happening.
As a nonpartisan organization, we encourage all of our viewers to vote. Senator, I am wondering if there are any key issues voters should be looking at for this year when voting, environmental or not.
Well, first of all, I would hope, you know, that part of people's involvement isn't just voting, but asking candidates, and there are a lot of ways to do it, a lot of Zoom town halls, a lot of Facebook pages, asking them directly, please answer specifically, not with a lot of political happy talk, how you regard and will vote on this issue that's a lot of importance to me, and really try to pin them down. We candidates find that a pain in the rear sometimes, but it's absolutely important. And there are websites that report on candidates' positions on these things. So there is that. And there, you know, there on the ballot that we're going to be receiving in the mail in the next few days, there are 4 statewide measures, measures 107, 108, 109, 110, 110, that are all important. I personally am voting yes on all of them. I was quite involved with 107, and this is the one for campaign finance reform, and it amends the Oregon state constitution. And whenever you amend the state constitution, you have to do it with the approval of the people, to make it completely clear that government or the people through the initiative process have the power to regulate and limit campaign financing. Oregon is one of 5 states with no limits, and there's a history to that. There was a belief for some time that limiting campaigns or requiring disclosure, this ad paid for by so-and-so, violated the Oregon constitutional guarantees for free speech, that money is speech and someone should be able to donate as much as they want because free speech should be unlimited. That I disagree, as do more and more and more people, but we are putting that in the Constitution so that we can pass measures to limit campaign donations and to, we hope, move towards people-powered politics instead of wealthy donor-powered politics in Oregon. That's 107. I'm passionate about it. I really recommend a yes vote there. The other three have to do with a measure to decriminalize a lot of substance abuse violations, and instead mandates treatment instead of jail for a lot of them. Another allows clinics for the use of psilocybin for certain kinds of mental challenges, and under the supervision of licensed professionals. And the other is a $2 a pack cigarette tax, increase in the cigarette tax that will be needed to fund Medicaid or the Oregon Health Plan, low income health care in Oregon. I'm a yes on all four, and I hope people take a real hard look at those. And then we could talk for the rest of the day about other issues that we need to pay attention to. And I guess the last thing I'll say about that is we'll have this election November 3rd. Your ballot's coming soon. Vote, do your homework, vote, but don't stop on November 3rd. The democracy that the founders had in mind and kind of wondered whether we were ready for or not requires us not just to vote. That's just the price of admission. We have to be in dialogue with the people we elect, from City Hall to Congress to the White House, on a continuous basis. Praise them when they do things that you like. Don't just complain. And then be very specific about what you expect from them. And I want to say, as an elected official, I think that the power of citizen input is underrated these days. We all talk about the power of money in politics, and it's excessive. But when we hear thoughtful input from citizens who have researched an issue and they're persistent about it and they're reasonably respectful about it, it makes a big difference. And I mean individual communication, just signing a petition or sending on a form email that's identical to 100 others I get. Yeah, I pay a little bit of attention, but I pay more attention to 4 or 5 personally written messages than 100 form messages, because that there you just click a button, and there's not really, I don't get the sense that somebody feels passionately about it necessarily. So stay involved. See, be the kind of citizen that can sustain a democracy.
Well, Senator Golden, thank you very much for your time. I think we're about to wrap up, and I hope to see all of you viewers at our next event, or one of our next events, on Thursday next week for microplastics in the environment and research and regulation on microplastics.
Lisa, thank you for the interview, and thanks very much to the organizers of the conference. This is an important Oregon institution, this conference, and really important to informing people to do the kind of citizenship I'm talking about. Appreciate it a lot.